Hi, everyone. Welcome to another one of our talks in the Digital Ethnic Studies series of talks sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters Interdisciplinary Research Cluster Funds. We are very excited to have with us Dr. Knight Steele, and I will introduce her in just a moment. Pam will read out our land acknowledgement before we get started.
Thanks so much, Sureshi. I'm going to start with the SDSU land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy, we promote this balance and harmony, we find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. And I'd also just like to add a technology acknowledgement. I acknowledge that this talk wouldn't be possible without Zoom, which is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Muwekma Ohlone and Tamian Nation in what we now call San Jose, California. This technology allows us to connect across vast distances, but it is not without its invisible costs, both in terms of human labor and environmental impact. Thank you.
All right. So welcome to Snatching Joy, Black Feminist Approaches to Digital Humanities. Dr. Knight Steele, who is a scholar of race, gender, and media with a specific emphasis on Black discursive practices and digital technology, will be talking about the digital activities of Black women online, which point us towards snatching joy as an act of resistance, expression of pleasure, and a speculative act of world building. In this talk, Dr. Steele walks through the praxis of digital Black feminism online and the implications for those who wish to incorporate Black feminist practices into their online lives, scholarship, teaching, and digital humanities work. Dr. Steele is the author of the award-winning Digital Black Feminism, and the practical guide, Doing Black Digital Humanities with Radical Intentionality. She serves as the director of the Black Communication and Technology Lab at the University of Maryland, where she is an associate professor of communication and director of the graduate certificate in digital studies in the arts and humanities. Welcome, Dr. Steele.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be with you all and to be in conversation with you today. I am getting over some health things, so my voice is a little bit lower, but I am going to try to project just as well as I possibly can. But I appreciate in advance your grace and your patience with me. I'll begin in the way that I begin with every talk, which is with gratitude. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, for those who made it possible through their work and their labor for me to participate and be in conversation with you, those who I know, and then those whose voices and names I don't know, those whose voices and names and work and labor make it possible for all of us to gather on the campuses that we gather upon and do the work of the mind. Their work often becomes invisible on our campuses, but it is our duty, our obligation, and indeed our privilege to stand alongside folks whose labor makes it possible for our own work to exist. Those are the folks who do things like book the meals, clean our classrooms, do landscaping and groundskeeping, do maintenance on our buildings. And so I always encourage everyone who comes and who listens to me talk to stand in solidarity with the workers on our campuses as they work to have better wages and better working conditions as well. So I'm going to begin this talk by talking about TikTok for a second, just because, as I said, I'm getting over an illness. I've been watching a lot of TikTok recently. And I don't know how many of you are active on TikTok or see what happens on TikTok a month or two later when it makes its way to Reels. But there is a content creator named Risa Tisa, who was very, very popular just a few weeks ago on TikTok, as she created a 50-part series on the app, that were 10 minutes long each, right? So hours and hours of content that she created on this app, outside of the traditional format, right? We kind of know TikTok as being a short form app. Risa Tisa made a series called Who the F Did I Marry?, where she detailed in great detail her run-in with and marriage to and subsequent divorce from someone she named, and we all kind of agree, was the pathological liar. This should be talked about for lots of reasons, and I think will be talked about by digital scholars for lots of reasons in the weeks and years to come. But I want to talk about it in one particular way today, which is the way that Risa Tisa was discussed on a show called The Breakfast Club. The Breakfast Club is a show that is hosted by a personality named Charlemagne the God. And on his show, he was talking about Risa Tisa's stardom and success that had come out of this TikTok series. But specifically what Charlemagne the God said was that the reason that Risa Tisa was able to be convinced of things by this man who was lying to her, the reason that these bad things happened to her was somehow bound up in the way that she looked. It was bound up in her Blackness, it was bound up in her womanness, and it was bound up in her size. He made specific fat-phobic comments about Risa Tisa and suggested that this was the reason why people were able to trick her so easily into thinking that someone would be in love with her. And when I heard these awful comments and saw folks' reaction to them on social media, it reminded me of something that is really fundamental to my work, or was fundamental to my work for years as a communication scholar, and that is the notion of the gaze, right? The gaze is this concept that provided us a framework to really understand what people bring to media messages, what audiences bring, and what's embedded deeply within them. It helped us theorize and conduct practical research around things like the male gaze, right? Where we could actually concern ourselves with bringing a critical lens to the way that women are over-sexualized and constructed through this hetero-patriarchal lens in television and film. The gaze also, though, brought us a way to think about Black culture as seen through the white gaze, gave us such archetypes as the mammy or the Jezebel or the sapphire figure, the brute. The white gaze, though, lingers in our depictions in the present day in entertainment and in politics. Just a few weeks ago, the 45th president of the United States provided us a reminder that the white gaze is still very prominent in our political sphere when he suggested that his present criminal indictments made him more appealing to Black voters. In fact, on Fox News, as his new sneaker line was released, a Fox contributor mentioned that he had been on social media the previous evening and saw something he said was fascinating. He said, quote, "As you see, Black support eroding from Joe Biden, these shoes are connecting with Black America because they're into sneakers. They love sneakers. This is a big deal, certainly in the inner city." So yeah, the gaze. It is an essential, critical way for us to understand how folks see us and through what lenses they do. In fact, I went to graduate school because of my interest in the gaze. There's this book called The Black Image and the White Mind that I read in undergrad. It was written by Andy Rejecki and Roger Entman, and I went to the University of Illinois Chicago to work with Andy Rejecki because I was really intrigued by this research that they were doing on how white television and newspaper, television viewers and newspaper readers understood Black America through their reading of the news and what impact that had on the kinds of political decisions that they might make. So the gaze has always figured really prominently in my own, but I think also in communication and media studies scholars' view of how to study race in media. Terry Sempt, though, asks us to move forward and through and beyond the gaze to understand the potential of what she calls the grab. So she argues that social media viewers produce, consume, circulate visual material not by gazing or glancing, but in a really tactile manner that she calls the grab. So Sempt writes about selfies and digital visual culture, and she suggests that the gaze falls short in ways that the grab actually excels as this embodied, personalized sensation, as a social metaphor, and points us towards expressions like land grab, attention grabbing, which all assume this kind of passive body being acted upon. What the grab does is it brings a physicality to our socially mediated environment. Sometimes we call that environment virtual, but it reminds us that our interactions with each other go far beyond viewing into situations where we reconstruct power dynamics that have real implications on the body. So as Sempt puts it, depending on how much social power I have in a given environment, when you grab me, I may acquiesce. I may grab you back. I may move elsewhere and so forth. These actions may be clearly visible, they may be obscured from my vision by all sorts of activities, or they may be intentionally hidden from view. Even people who swear in principle that everything's fair game on the internet make personal choices of how they deal with images that are up for grabs as they cross geographies and temporalities. So in this way, SEMT is arguing that digital artifacts don't just appear on our screens. They're doing things to us emotionally, technologically, economically, and politically by circulating through our networked bodies. The grab for SEMT is a repositioning of sorts for the casual social media user, for avid content creators, and for us, the researcher, because it has implications on how we participate in the producing and sharing of images and on what kinds of questions we choose to ask about their impact. I think it's no mistake that Terry Sempt begins that essay by speculating on a particular grab effect as made prominent by images of Sandra Bland. I'll remind you all that Sandra Bland was a 28-year-old woman who was detained by the police in July of 2015. Video footage of her traffic stop went viral, and in that footage, Bland was threatened, forced to the ground, and arrested on the premise that she failed to use a turn signal. 3 days later, she was found hanged in her jail cell. Sandra Bland grew up in Naperville, suburb of Chicago, where I'm from. She graduated from Prairie View A&M University. She played trombone. She volunteered with a senior citizens advocacy organization. And she was scheduled to begin her dream job just a few weeks after her death. Controversy and contention swirled around her death. And Sempt argues that the grab, instead of pointing us toward her death, points us toward her life. The images that she left behind for us in the form of her selfies and her videos online. She posted videos just months prior to her death about the injustice of the criminal justice system. She noted in one post, quote, "In the news that we've seen as of late, you could stand there, surrender to the cops, and still be killed." For Sempt, recollecting Bland helps us understand how folks grab at the digital artifacts of Black women, even in our death. Some are for profit. Others are to pacify feelings of guilt. Some grab at her digital records as an explanation or justification for her death. Some grab at her to remember her life. But the grab helps us understand the implications of taking pieces of Bland, some that she offered and others that we have constructed about her. There are several other Black women scholars that shift our attention away from the products that Black women produce to their actions as digital experts. Elisa Hardy writes about the power in Black women's names and naming practices as agentic. In considering the power of the Say Her Name campaign, she asks, how does Say Her Name respond to nominal Blackness? To challenge the supremacy of traumatic narratives as the structuring logic of anti-Blackness is made manifest through Black death. She asks, how do constituents of Say Her Name employ Afro-nostalgia as a practice of memory activism that brings together the promises of racial redemption and a romantic reclamation of the historical past? I always have to pause right there because, spoiler alert, Elisa Hardy is my advisee, and I just think it's lovely writing. She says, the racial redemption and romantic reclamation of historical past. That's top tier, right? So naming and digital naming practices move us closer to acknowledging Black women in their fullness, is Hardy's argument, right? Moya Bailey, in her brilliant work, Misogynoir Transformed, redefines and opens us up to the ideas of the drag. So she writes about the difference between drag culture and the form of drag that's been popularized by Black men like Tyler Perry's Medea, a form that she explains is kind of a long-standing form of drag where men are donning dresses for comedic effect. And Black women, agender folks, non-binary folks tend to be the most frequent targets of that comedic effect. She calls attention to the ways that folks are dragged online, using the term both literally and figuratively, because to drag is to pull aggressively, but colloquially, to drag someone is to roughly admonish them verbally. In her essay, Drag Them, Meredith Clark likewise traces cancel culture as a digital discursive accountability practice from its origins in Black orality, all the way to the misappropriation that's happening online right now by social elites. So she's using this popular vernacular of dragging to introduce and expand upon the idea. In my first book, Digital Black Feminism, I consider the possibilities of capture as a heuristic for understanding the capacities and constraints of Black feminist praxis and technoculture. I argue that content creators like Lovia J.E., who we see here on the screen, mirror some of the same practices of Black feminist writers like Zora Neale Hurston, whose work sought to capture Black life as it was. Not as a means to prove value to white audiences, but to revel in the fullness of our Black existence. So Ajayi's capture as a blogger and online content creator extends and shows some of the fallacies too of this imagined beautiful digital space. Because even as she uses tools like Instagram stories to capture moments in her life, like her wedding that's here, or curate an image for the public, that same public builds a sense of entitlement to her body, to her ideas, to her image. They use that social media to capture her back. So we grab and we're grabbed. We name, but we're named. We drag and then we're dragged. We capture and then we're captured. The means of our agency and our freedom is so often the same as our bondage. So today I'm building from these Black women scholars and proposing a Black feminist praxis called Snatching Joy as a method and as a praxis for Black digital humanities. What does it mean for us to snatch joy? Let's start with the definition, right? To discuss snatch as a verb, we would call it something as defined roughly as to seize or to grasp hastily or abruptly, to take suddenly without permission, without ceremony, without right. And I'll argue that joy requires that kind of rough seizure on the part of Black women, that the suddenness and abruptness combats how joy is so frequently hidden away from, and that waiting for permission or a right is only a means of that we end up losing out on our ability to hold on to joy. But first, let's talk about what snatching joy requires. Black women must imagine ourselves with access to something that we don't currently have, but which is due us. We must imagine a world not as it is, but what it could be as a mode of survival. We have to craft for ourselves possibilities using the digital tools at our disposal. And so I would argue first that snatching joy requires speculation. Shamara Moore, argues that part of Black feminist praxis is a commitment to Black joy despite the bleakness of circumstance. And this is achieved, as she imagines, through our speculative imaginary. This means that a Black feminist future acknowledges a Black feminist past. Snatching joy is speculative, but it carries with it an act of retrieval. It's a reminder that the bleakness of our present does not negate the joys of our past or the imagination of our liberated future. Black speculative fiction showcases these possibilities. So what does a Black feminist speculative technoculture look like? Well, I talked to a great group of students just the other day, and according to them, it's fandoms, right? That we can see this Black feminist future so well through our fandoms. Rebecca Wanzo outlines how fandoms are usually studied as a white phenomenon, but that there is an extensive history of Black fandoms and their connections to the community. That there is pride and resistance bound up in this idea of Black fandom. Kristen Warner, in her study of Black fans and the show Scandal, explains that producing content is a necessary act of agency for women of color who strive for visibility in a landscape that favors a more normative, read white, fan identity, and that often dismisses and diminishes the desires of its diverse body to see themselves equally represented on screen and in the fan community at large. We can also see this in Sarah Florini's reading of the hashtag Dem Thrones, which offers a gathering place for Black fans of the show Game of Thrones. Ebony Thomas writes of an emancipatory Black fantastic that's capable of, quote, interrupting the dark fantastic cycles in order to create new paradigms. She writes, when we dream inside the story world of printed and digital books and fan fiction and fan art and videos and television shows, movies, comics, graphic novels, online fandom communities, and fan cons, do those worlds offer all kinds of people escape from the world as we know it? Could they offer catharsis for some of our most pressing human problems? Might they help us collectively imagine a world anew? Shamara Moore does a reading of Alexis Pauline Gumb's short story Evidence, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it, which details this Black feminist speculative technoculture, a piece of speculative fiction that places Black feminist technologists at the center of a world-bending tale that imagines our future. Moore explains that Gumb's tale forces the reader to deal with our current reality and our unwillingness as a society to evolve by placing us into this speculative future. She writes, I have used my imagination to access it, but it is not imaginary. We can make that connection between this idea of a Black speculative future and Afrofuturism, but I actually would encourage us instead to think about it in relationship to Afro nostalgia, Afro presentism, and Afro skepticism. While Afrofuturism forces us to imagine or understand that there are Black people in the future, Afropresentism requires us to deal with the Black folks of the now. Badia Ahad Lahardi offers Afro-nostalgia as a corrective, insisting on a lingering historical Black joy. In my forthcoming book with Kevin Winstead, Rihanna Walcott, and a number of other great folks called Techno-Skepticism, we wrestle with this idea in relationship to what we're calling Afro-skepticism. As we collectively write, if Afro-skepticism allows us to refuse orientations such as Afro-pessimism or Afro-optimism, how might critical positions inform how we read technological objects and their possibilities? How is refusal a necessary position that skepticism needs in order to offer alternatives? The metaphor of Afro-skepticism is a sophisticated theoretical position that holds a possibility for either rejection or conditional acceptance of technologies that can scaffold Black joy. Joy can come from places in technoculture that overtly reject it and have been rejected by it. Refusal and skepticism come from our historically justified skepticism about whether our claims to humanity will be honored and the pleasures to be had in the acts of disidentification and disavowal. So snatching joy requires speculation, but it is a Black feminist speculative technoculture that's rooted in skepticism, nostalgia, and presentism rather than optimism or futurism. I would say that next, that snatching joy requires cultivation. There is a labor involved in cultivating joy. There is a development involved in this process. To document that kind of cultivation of joy that I wrote about in Digital Black Feminism, I'll point us back to some early internet history and consider the Black blogosphere of the early 2000s and early 2010s. See, Black feminist thinkers through long-form writing and community building and digital archiving began to craft what I call foundational principles for digital Black feminist rhetoric that we now see on sites like TikTok and Twitter and Instagram. But blogging itself provided a landscape for digital Black feminists to work out principles through a dialogue that was protected from outside interference. Unlike spaces like Twitter or X, where groups might seek to engage with other publics, to foster actions, to boycott, debate, right? Bloggers formed these alternate publics that they refashioned, where they refashioned Black feminism in the digital age outside the gaze of the dominant group. So while they may have been posting recommendations for hair care products, discussing Beyonce, or watching Scandal each week, Black feminist bloggers were advocating for emancipatory freedom and reconceptualizing our liberation within this digital framework. The principles that they formed in the blogosphere are not only articulated online, but they exist because of Black feminist relationship to online culture. In that original study, I charted 5 principles that Black bloggers use to make rhetorical arguments for Black feminism. They prioritize their agency, the right to self-identify. They centralize gender non-binary spaces of discourse. They create complicated allegiances, and they insert a dialectic of self and community interests. Now, I want to be clear here that by principles, I don't mean that I trace people's beliefs. That's not my discipline. Instead, my approach and method seeks to point me toward how folks deploy arguments in these spaces about Black feminist thought, and how the spaces where they develop and deploy those arguments shape the arguments themselves. In other words, they cultivate a practice of joy that's replicable for other Black folks online. And I won't go into too much depth about each one of these, but let's just take agency as an example. Cultivating a practice of agency has a long history in Black feminist thought. Black women are, unsurprisingly, very concerned with the capacity of individuals to act as independent agents and make their own choices. But for traditional Black feminist scholars, agency has been bound to systems of capitalism because of the focus on individual prosperity, financial independence. Its deployment, though, as an argument for digital Black feminists is something different, something more nuanced, more complex. The difference in how Black feminists conceptualize agency is a product of their relationship to the technologies they have access to at the time. At least that's my claim. So as it's taken up by digital Black feminists, agency signals Black women's ability to master and adopt a strategy for liberation that intentionally is pulling at the most salient features of a neoliberal American culture: personal liberty, individualism. So by embracing agency, digital Black feminists are working against the racist logic that supports Black women's exclusion from the mythology and history of digital technology. For digital Black feminists, agency redefines the self as powerful and skillful within a system of technology and digital culture. So now, rather than being trapped by the gaze, by controlling images, by over-sexualized female bodies, digital Black feminists are suggesting that they control their bodies and images online, and that this itself is transformative and transgressive, no matter who is watching. So while agency and self-determination might point us toward the individual, those other principles there signal that cultivation of joy is not a singular or individualist endeavor. This is important to remember. We're not talking about crafting happiness, but joy, because if happiness is visible on the surface, joy resides beneath the pain. Joy must be cultivated, often out of the sight of others, so that it can be returned to again and again. And it's within these enclave spaces like the blogosphere, what I call the virtual beauty shop, that Black women snatch joy through the rhetorical work of creating arguments in community toward their own freedom. The last way I'll talk about that practice of snatching joy is as an embodied experience. And here I'll point to Zora Neale Hurston's assertion that the linguistic and the physical are each permeated by a similar cultural expression: drama, the will to adorn, imitation, asymmetry, angularity. So for Hurston, the embodied experience of Blackness often takes place in the full view of the dominant group, but with no regard to their presence. And that is the very activity of snatching joy. In my favorite essay of Zora Neale Hurston's, Characteristics of Negro Expression, which was published in 1934, she writes, "No matter how joyful or how sad the case, there is sufficient poise for drama. Everything's acted out." She's not suggesting here that Black expression is reactive or performative for the white gaze. Instead, her description of the absence of the concept of privacy, as she calls it, means that Black people have accepted that there is always an audience, and that an audience is a necessary part of any drama. Black people have accepted this because we've never been afforded the true sense of privacy. Therefore, visible drama, even online, is not inherently performative. Joan Morgan argues for what she calls a pleasure politics, which she suggests is a liberatory Black feminist project. So pleasure politics disentangles principles and desires, and it requires us to treat Black women as full human agents, capable of complex political life, beings who seek desire, who seek out and achieve pleasure, even as these things seem incongruous to outsiders. In this framework, Black women are allowed the freedom granted at birth to those who occupy white, cis male bodies, those whose humanity goes unchallenged in our society. She frames pleasure as libidinal, rather than a performance of sexuality connected to the acquisition of capital or validation of others. Andre Brock's really brilliant work on the libidinal economy helps us understand this a bit better, because it functions as an answer to this overemphasis on extraction or resistance, which he argues leaves no space for what is simply pleasurable. So instead of performing the erotic as labor within a capitalist system, or visible joy as a public outcry against oppression, Brock and Morgan consider how desire and pleasure drive the individual. And then Hurston gives us the lens through which to take this Black feminist politic of pleasure and layer it onto the visible practices of Black women online. So consider, if you will, just for a moment, back to TikTok for a minute, and we can think of TikTok creators. And I want you to journey with me back to the year of 2020. It was a very different place, both in society and on TikTok. That's when I first got on TikTok, and it was gaining popularity in the US after the dissolution of Vine, as Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook all had this kind of short loop story content that was beginning to integrate into their platforms. And TikTok at this time is promising users an experience in content creation that's accessible to a large audience and is driven by the algorithm rather than by an offline social network. And previous studies have examined TikTokers' behaviors. They've called them attention-seeking, explicitly citing how women and girls specifically use the app to gain social recognition. They've talked about how TikTokers are boxed in by ideals of white normative femininity. Crystal Abedin situated her study of TikTok within celebrity and influencer culture, exploring how the site and its users rely upon attention economy. And each of these approaches adds a lot of value to our understanding of TikTok. But none of them fully explains Black content creators, specifically Black women content creators, and how they've become the driving force behind, and often without credit, for the app's popularity in the US. To demonstrate, TikTok entered mainstream popular culture in the US because of viral dance trends, like the renegade and the savage. right? Created by Black women users like Jelaya Harmon and Kiera Wilson, respectively, TikTok is a platform whose users are at once hyper concerned with originality and mimicry. So Zuli and Zuli conceptualized the site as an imitation public, a collection of people whose digital connectivity is constituted through their shared ritual of content imitation and replication. In 2020, many of us were introduced to TikTok via these viral dances. In 2021, Black content creators on TikTok went on strike, refusing to post choreography for a new song by Megan Thee Stallion that summer that was called Thought Shit. Without a dance to imitate, TikTokers' reliance on Black women became very readily apparent over that week. The strike that was based really on the frustration that a lot of Black women, primarily viral dance trends, were either miscredited to more prominent white TikTokers, or that white TikTokers were receiving more opportunities based on their mimicry than on Black users' originality. So one user wrote, "It's not even the mediocrity, it's the opportunities they're getting despite being mediocre." One such opportunity was The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, where he showcased a whole host of viral TikTok trends, nearly all of which had been originally choreographed by Black women, but were featured Addison Rae, who's on the screen there, was a prominent white TikToker at the time. So Hurston's 1934 essay describes Black dance as asymmetric and angular. She says it's the lack of symmetry which makes Negro dancing so difficult for white dancers to learn. But on an app built around imitation and mimicry, white users do learn and are often rewarded handily for mimicry. During the strike, Black content creators duetted white users' videos to showcase lackluster dances or poorly timed lip syncs. When they post a duet on TikTok, your video plays on the left side of the screen while the original video plays simultaneously. It's kind of a perfect site for signifying practices. Black users duetted one pair of white teens and mocked the disconnect between the song lyrics from that Meg Thee Stallion song, which says, "Hands on my knees, shaking ass on my thought shit." And the young women disregard the instruction that Megan gives them, and they breezily kind of raise their hands and wave them as they walk away from the camera. Now, Hurston explains, speaking of the use of Negro material by white performers, quote, "It is astonishing that so many are trying it, and I have never seen one yet entirely realistic. They all have all the elements of the song, the dance, the expression, but they are misplaced or distorted by the accent falling on the wrong element. Everyone seems to think that the Negro is easily imitated, when nothing is further from the truth." But this thought demonstration strike, right? This strike on the part of content creators explains a difference in how Black and white users were approaching the dance. As Hurston explains, the difference is in the art of the two. The white dancer attempts to express fully, while the Negro is restrained, but succeeds in gripping the beholder by forcing him to finish the action the performer suggests. There was a simultaneous trend in 2021 on TikTok called Dance Like a White Girl. In this trend, Black and other persons of color primarily were dancing to the song, "How Deep Is Your Love?" But they would put their hands up in the sky, they would body roll, close their eyes, jump, and move around to the song's lyrics rather than to the beat. Some users were commenting that, quote, "dancing like a white woman felt freeing, with a true sense of dancing like no one's watching." Many users were tapping into what they were calling a, quote, "liberating experience" that's usually reserved for bodies unlike their own. But perhaps the greater pleasure came in signifying upon the group of women most likely to profit from Black women's dance choreography on the app. So you see, I resist the inclination here to name these trends, these responses, as forms of resistance, because it's essential to note that those participating in a trend are doing so in the full view of a white audience. Likewise, this kind of trend, this strike, can be analyzed as this act of resistance, but the mockery and the signifying and the withholding, I would point back to what Brock calls the libidinal site of pleasure of it. Dancing on TikTok might indeed feed an attention economy, but if primarily white users are rewarded in this system, we have to look at Black users' motivation and impulse as something more than attention seeking. So Morgan encourages us to recognize that Black women's pleasure is not only an integral part of a fully realized humanity, but it's capable of intersecting, challenging, and redefining our dominant narratives about race, beauty, sex, health in ways that are generative and necessary. From this example, I hope what we understand is that snatching joy is an embodied experience online. The use and subsequent withholding of the body snatches joy that is often taken through cultural absorption, through mimicry, through appropriation. We can also see the need to explore in more depth the relationship between joy and pleasure, and how these two experiences have to be studied as acts of both the mind and the body. So why do Black women have to snatch joy? I think this last example also helps us understand why we have to snatch joy, not request it, not plead for it, not ask for it, but snatch it. Because Bell Hooks describes what many have since called cultural appropriation as the act of eating the other. In her essay, she writes that this visceral and violent, she writes about a visceral and violent description of appropriation, but I think it's necessary because when we sanitize the activity of consuming culture and the very personage of other people, we're doing a disservice. The act of eating the other, described in her 1992 essay, Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance, describes the tendency of the dominant group to make use of pieces of marginalized culture for their gain and to the detriment of that marginal culture. Hooks takes the phrase from a British slang, where getting a bit of the other is a colloquialism for sexual encounters of the white upper class or middle class men with exotic non-white others. Beyond just cultural appropriation, though, I think Hooks's essay and her use of this colloquialism remind us of the harm there is in seeing another human as something to be consumed. Hooks uses cannibalism as a metaphor for the violence that's enacted upon marginalized communities by dominant groups who wish to eat them metaphorically in order to feel and appear more alive. To appropriate someone's culture is to place yourself in a position of power, to determine how and to what extent and in what spaces that culture is useful, and when it's acceptable, when it's disdainful. This separates appropriation from appreciation. This pain that's inflicted upon the group whose culture is taken and used and disregarded when it's no longer in fashion is real. It goes beyond a metaphorical pain, and Hooks uses that metaphor of cannibalism and eating to make clear that taking culture from someone else is a violent act that leaves the victim less whole. I'm going to come back to this briefly, but I think this is particularly important for those of us who are doing digital humanities scholarship and are using Black culture and Black artifacts as our subject matter. So what is so radical about snatching joy? I'd first contend that simply studying Black joy, researching it, is a radical act within the academy, which calls upon us to focus on Blackness because of its relationship to deviance, death, and violence. When I finished writing Digital Black Feminism and I had the opportunity to do some interviews about the book, I was maybe naively shocked at how many of the first questions people asked me were about violence against Black women. The book itself doesn't spend a lot of time talking about violence against Black women. It talks about Black women's creative entrepreneurship online. It talks about the history of Black technoculture. It talks about our expertise. It talks about community. It talks about our brilliant rhetorical arguments. And yet the questions that I was being asked were about Black death and Black violence, because that is the comfortable space for the academy to think about Blackness. I think it's also radical for us to talk about snatching joy because retrieving what is owed to us doesn't always happen within the bounds of what is considered gracious or collegial or even legal. This isn't necessarily an advocacy for violence or theft. Instead, it is an advocacy for justice and how that might actually look in practice when we centralize Black folks in our work. Let's turn specifically to Black DH just for a moment. Suppose that Black Digital Humanities is simply digital humanities with Black subjects. In that case, the subfield will follow on a path that abdicates goals of Black liberation in favor of centering projects that produce capital investment without investment in Black people and Black liberation. So snatching joy as a Black woman scholar in DH means prioritizing a praxis of care in my work. Black DH praxis of care requires flexibility within an inflexible system that was not designed to liberate or provide support for Black people. Black DH praxis of care foregrounds feeding our communities by prioritizing the material needs of students, precarious faculty and staff, in our programming, in our allocation of resources. A Black DH praxis of care relies on our own knowledge and expertise, our resources, our labor as scholars and practitioners that are already marginalized within the academy and DH. A Black praxis of care means decentering tools in favor of affirming Black theory, Black experience, Black cultural practices of learning, doing, and making. So ultimately, whether our DH project use materials from the 1800s or those from 18 minutes ago, those who wish to study digital culture or use digital tools, I think should develop a relationship with slow work. Slow work is not to say that we should do away with big data projects or computational analysis in favor of these kind of close readings. But instead, I'm advocating for slow work as a practice of care for researchers, for teachers, for texts, for students, and as a mechanism to snatch joy from the systems that would otherwise curtail it in our DH practice. Moya Bailey makes the case that digital humanities scholarship that hopes to engage in the lives and liberation of Black people must slow down. Bailey argues that we must move at the pace of trust. She explains an ethics of pace means that the ends do not justify the means, but rather the means are the ends. By remaining attentive to the people involved in our research, keeping the human at the center of DH, we can create a process that doesn't cause harm, or at least reduces it. That the pace of life and the pace of our research are something that humans can control. Slowing down has allowed me to bring a different strategy of care to the classroom, to research, to my administration of DH centers. It also has brought some joy. The words happiness and joy are distinct concepts in their origins and in their manifestations in African-American cultural discourses. The German word glücklich and the French word heureux imply a sense, an intense but generalized, almost euphoric view of one's current existence. They're kind of like English joy. The word happiness, though, as Goddard claims, has a comparatively muted quality. Kovessis explains that happiness is marked by its responsiveness to unpleasant situations, an individual's decision to change perspectives, the lightness of the energy of happy people, the ability to pass on this happiness to others. But used colloquially in African-American religious vernacular, happiness is often considered in juxtaposition to joy. Comparing the two, Shirley Caesar saying of joy, "The world didn't give it to me and the world can't take it away." Recently adding to this theorization of Black joy, activist and online writer Brittany Patnett Cunningham has argued that joy is resistance, that oppression doesn't have room for happiness. You resist it when you find joy anyhow. But beyond the duty to perform happiness, Patnett is really insisting that conscious acts and expressions of joy are vital forms of resistance in a society that's shaped by oppression, racism, and violence. Now, I agree, joy is resistance. But it's not only resistance, at least it must not be. We can cultivate and even study Black joy, but only if we regard those who inhabit it apart from their position as subject. Black joy doesn't exist for the viewer and the audience. It's not predicated on pain or resistance. And as we commit to becoming better casual users of social media, better content creators, and hopefully better researchers, I hope that we make space for joy, lest it need to be snatched back from those we never recognized had it to begin with. So thanks so much, and I look forward to the conversation. I also always want to put this up. There is a little bibliography here of all the folks that I cited. If you want to read more, you can scan that QR code and get access to it. It's just a Google Doc. I'll also drop it in the chat, the link in the chat for folks.